Good morning. Welcome to the Point. It's more than a year until the next general election, but already people are lining up to run for everything from governor to state house. That includes attorney general. At least 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats have expressed interest. You'll meet one of each this morning, starting with Democrat Patrick Miles. Well, the obvious place to start is why? Why have you chosen now? Obviously, there'll be a vacancy in the attorney general's office, but why do you choose now to run?
Well, I finished up my term and tenure as United States Attorney in the Western District of Michigan on January 20th of 2017, and I really enjoyed that job of fighting crime, protecting the public, preventing frauds, preventing crime, and this is a continuation of that public service. The Attorney General position, the responsibilities are very similar, if not the same, as the United States Attorney, and that job touches everyone's life in every way, and so this is a job that I feel I'm well suited for, having led one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the state.
Well, and this is the chief law enforcement officer for the state. It's a big job, and there are a lot of circumstances out there that you have to deal with. Everything from fraud to violent crimes to even things that happened. I know when Frank Kelly was the attorney general for all those years, he was very serious about making sure scanners at stores were reading the right price. So, I mean, it runs the gambit of things. So your experience as an attorney and as a U.S. attorney obviously would put you right in the thick of this. What are some of the things that the attorney general of this state you think should be focused on in the next 4 years?
Well, you mentioned Frank Kelly, and we had the crown jewel of consumer protection divisions under Frank Kelly. We had the first in the nation consumer protection division in an attorney general's office. And so that, unfortunately, has been gutted by the law. The Michigan Supreme Court and activist Supreme Court really gutted the law and reduced that authority. And the division has lost a lot of the priority that used to be placed on it. So I'd like to restore that priority of consumer protection, and also to advocate for the strengthening of our consumer protection laws. Also, this office can be used more for battling against the Trump administration when it comes out with unconstitutional measures and fighting back and pushing back against things that are coming out of Washington, D.C. And we can also do more to battle the opioid epidemic and be an advocate for that. That's something I did as United States Attorney through prevention and prosecution, as well as education and enforcement and treatment. And so we can do more in the state. There's more resources in the state that we can utilize the information that's in the different providers, healthcare providers and treatment providers, as well as law enforcement, to battle opioids and heroin.
Let's talk a little bit about the first thing you said in there. And obviously the opioid addiction is something that we focus on very strongly here in a series of stories that we've done. We know that that's a national problem. Let's go back to the first thing you said. You could use it to battle against the Trump administration when they issue unconstitutional directives. Give me an example.
Well, one would be what's going on now with the Affordable Care Act and the undercutting of the Medicaid expansion. And that's something even Attorney General Schuitmaker fought at the beginning of the Affordable Care Act, the expansion of the Medicaid. He and the governor, I think, were on opposite sides of that. And so that's something that millions of people are going to be hurt, the vulnerable, in terms of their insurance premiums. And anyone who's using an insurance exchange is going to see premium increases. And so that's something that attorneys general are filing lawsuits against the Trump administration to fight against. Same thing goes with a number of the immigration orders that are coming out of D.C., as well as some of the things that are coming in terms of the education department and what's going on with student loans and things like that. And so these are lawsuits that attorneys general across the nation are really pushing back. And so the action is in the Attorney General office.
When you think of another one of those topics that you touched on, the opioid addiction, and you think of how pervasive it has become, and I know that the medical community is trying to do more to counter the availability of opioids, but it's out there. And, and I mean, this is the addiction next door, because this is not about a particular class or socioeconomic. This goes everywhere, doesn't it?
That's right. This epidemic crosses all demographic lines. It hits every community, whether it's urban, rural, suburban, affluent, less affluent. People are getting hooked on prescription painkillers when they're being misused, or people are using someone else's prescription painkillers because they're laying around in the medicine cabinet, forgotten about. So teenagers are getting into this, and then those painkillers are leading to heroin addictions because it's the same high. And heroin is much more available than the pills, it's less expensive, and it's more dangerous, of course, because there's not as much consistency in the potency. And so that's why people are overdosing. And so we definitely need to have a more uniform approach to this. Even medical examiners in the different counties aren't necessarily required to list the cause of the overdose death, the drug specifically. They can say indeterminate drug overdose. So we may not even know where some of these heroin overdoses are happening.
When you think about running for public office, I know you've done this before, and it is something that is a big undertaking, particularly in a statewide race. And I will explain in other parts of the show why this is a little unusual, because you don't have a primary, or at least not a conventional primary, that will be voted on next August. This decision will be made by people attending the state party convention. So that makes it a little different, because you really don't solicit for that wholesale vote until November of next year. But what gets you, obviously you want the job, but what keeps you in the political arena? Because it is not always an easy place to be, and I might suggest in recent years has become an even more difficult place to be.
Well, my parents really instilled in me the value of serving others, and when I was growing up here in Grand Rapids, and they were always engaged and active in the community, and I was active and engaged in the community during my 21 years of private law practice. And so I really do want to make this a better state and a better country, and I feel very passionately about that. I came back to Grand Rapids right after law school in 1991, and because I love this community and I love this state. And so that's what keeps me engaged in the political process now, is that this is a form of public service. Now, I'm not a career politician, as you know. I've served as United States Attorney, and before that I served in private law practice and a number of charitable boards and committees. So I feel that I'm running as really an outsider to Lansing, but I have the experience that's required for this position after having served as United States Attorney.
This year, for example, as we get into the election cycle of 2018, there will be a wholesale turnover of leadership in Lansing. There'll be a new governor, a lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state. 70% of all the members of the state Senate will be leaving, more than a third of all the members of the House. What does that say? We don't know who replaces all of those positions, but we know it's going to be a whole new leadership team, which could make being in Lansing a pretty interesting event.
It could, and certainly we've seen Lansing being under single party control for several years, and so I'm also, as Attorney General, I'll be very interested to see if there's any government corruption that's been occurring over the past 8 years, and I would definitely look forward to being a watchdog to protect the taxpayer, to see in the government contracting and bidding processes and other things, and there's so much money flowing into Lansing now, especially with these new campaign finance rules that are allowing almost unlimited amounts to come into campaigns or political action committees, independent expenditures, that could cause some bad behavior. And I want to see if there's any of that going on. But you're right, and I've got the experience as a former United States Attorney to come in and do the job on day one. I know what programs work, I know what doesn't work, and so I think that experience that I have from outside Lansing will be very relevant to the job of Attorney General. You
talk about corruption, or the potential of corruption, and looking in. I mean, how much time, should you be elected, do you spend looking backwards, understanding that there's a whole lot looking forward too?
That's true. That is the balance, and that's what you do as Attorney General, and I did as United States Attorney. You balance your resources and you allocate them in terms of what your priorities are. But I definitely think the taxpayers deserve to know that they have clean government, and so I think that would be one of my first priorities, to look backward, to make sure that there's a clean government, and looking forward to some of the new initiatives that we need to do to reinvigorate the Consumer Protection Division, as I mentioned earlier, to battle the opioid epidemic, because people's lives are at stake on that, and to continue to fight violent crime and protect the vulnerable and children from child exploitation and other risks and dangers that are out there. That's job one of an Attorney General, is to protect the public.
One of the things that we hear a lot about in government these days is access to the ballot box, and to some degree the Attorney General would have oversight of that too, as it is a legal issue. Do you think that as Attorney General you would look more carefully about the access to the vote? Because I know that there are people that are concerned about occasionally trying to implement voter ID laws or having certain parameters. Is that a concern for you?
Absolutely it is. I think access to the vote is very important in America. It's a fundamental right. It's the way we as the American people express who we are, what we want to do, and what we want our government to be. And so that's something that is very important. So people who try to restrict access to the vote, to me, it doesn't make sense, because it's really a concession on their part that their views aren't going to carry the day with a majority of American citizens. And so we should want every American to be voting. People fought and died for that privilege that we can exercise and that our voice matters. And so that's something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's coming from a family of people who've served in the military and people who have fought for that vote.
Given the wholesale change that we talked about earlier in this coming election cycle, as a political reporter, I'm prone to say that each election is the most important, the next election. How important is this election cycle, given that part of it is going to be the big change in the state of Michigan, part of it is going to be a referendum on Donald Trump, part of it's going to be a referendum on what's been going on in the state for the past 8 years. How big is this cycle?
These are very dangerous times, and so we've seen some unprecedented things coming out of Washington, D.C. with the Trump administration, and we've seen things out of Lansing with Flint and other water and other crises. We've seen some problems with the Grand Rapids Home for Veterans. We've seen a lot of issues, and so these are challenges that we face as a state, and this is a very critical election. I think up and down the ballot, every election, every campaign is going to be very important, and I'm encouraging every voter to vote and to pay attention to these candidates who are running, and to look at their record, look at their experience, and look at what their values are, and to see what kind of leader they'll be when they're in office.
At least one other Democrat, Dana Nessel, says she'll run for the Attorney General spot too. And remember, that's not a primary race. Those will actually be chosen at the state convention next year. When we come back, one of the Republicans who also wants to be AG. To the Point. Welcome back to the Point. There is a big field of candidates gathering for next year's really big election, including some who would like to be Attorney General. Now, here's one of those Republicans, State Senator Tanya Schuitmaker. Senator, you're no stranger to this. You ran for the House 3 times, is that right? For the Senate
two-year
twice?
terms, yes,
right.
and the Senate twice.
So now you're going to run for the Attorney General's position. It's a little different because it's not a primary. It's selected at the state convention, as we've mentioned throughout this show. But nonetheless, we know that there'll be competition within the Republican Party. But let's start with why. Why do you want to do this now?
I'm running because I have a passion for the law and public service, and I feel we need an Attorney General that has a strong record, that has run in competitive seats before, and will stand up for the conservative principles.
One of the things that people sometimes lose track of is the scope of the Attorney General's office, because it certainly deals with crime as you think of it on a daily basis, but it has to deal with all of the other functions of the office. What are some of the more important things? I mean, there's everything from fraud to the criminal cases to any number of things.
Well, you bring up a very good point. When people think of the Attorney General's office, they think of, you know, the top cop. But actually, there's 7 different practice areas within the Attorney General's office. Everything from dealing with civil cases, dealing with child support, dealing with representing all the state agencies. So it is all encompassing. I think I have a strong record. I was an attorney in private practice that dealt with all different sorts of cases, and I think that will serve me well as the next Attorney General. And I think I have a strong record in terms of dealing with opioid abuse and protecting seniors and the vulnerable.
Those are 2 areas that will obviously be important. The opioid abuse is something that other candidates have mentioned, but we have talked about on this show so often. It has become such an epidemic. What can you do from a law enforcement standpoint or a governmental standpoint? I know you've worked on legislation, both the House and Senate have worked on legislation.
Yes, currently I have a bill in the Senate, or actually it's over in the House, but it's a Senate bill that I've drafted that came out of the governor's task force, which I was honored that the governor appointed me to, dealing with the mandatory reporting so that doctors check an already existing system. This will cut down on pill mills and also doctor shopping, and hopefully take a lot of the illegal opioids out of the stream out there.
How much of that job, I mean, you said there were 7 different legal practices within the Attorney General's office, but how much of it does deal with the day in, day out drug trafficking or human trafficking or any of those issues that are the real kind of the crime part of law?
Well, the criminal division is just one practice group in the Attorney General's office. The rest is, whether it's civil or other types of issues of law dealing with, it's all encompassing. So I think the general practice that I've had as a private attorney, and then the almost 12 years in the legislature will serve me well, and I think I have a great record to run on.
What would you want to focus on if you were successful? And again, this process is a little different than if you're running for Senate. You might have a primary. This will go to the state convention in August of next year, I believe. But if you're successful coming out of that and you were in the general election, what would you want to focus on in terms of what you want to do if you become Attorney General?
Well, certainly continuing on with my record, dealing with helping solve this huge opioid epidemic that we have out in our communities. Certainly I have also a great record dealing with human trafficking, which is also a very current event that is affecting our communities, and as well as senior protection and helping the vulnerable. But also a new crime that is coming up is with, if you look at the Equifax breach, that is certainly, cybersecurity is going to be a top priority for the next Attorney General, and I intend to take that very seriously and crack down and protect people's identities and their financial information.
When you look at something like that Equifax breach, and that effectively got most of the people's information in the state of Michigan, if I read it correctly, because they keep adding and adding to it. Now, maybe I'm naive. What I would have expected a company at that level to have more security. I don't know how they got in. Maybe they were very sophisticated. What can an Attorney General do? Can you kind of oversee some of those things or require people operating here to have more security?
Certainly, if you see a company out there that is not protecting their citizens' private information, you can certainly take action. The Attorney General's office is a very powerful office, so they can bring lawsuits against big corporations. They can also, enter into class action lawsuits with other states. They can push back on federal overreach. So these are all very important issues that the Attorney General's office does and takes care of.
In the past few years, all the way from Kalamazoo to Flint, even now we're finding in the Rockford area where we may have water problems. We had an oil spill, obviously the water crisis in Flint. Attorney General would have some environmental focus too, I would assume.
Yes, certainly, as you bring up, it's all broad reaching, and so it's one of the most powerful positions in the whole state of Michigan.
This is a big, big election. And nobody can say with any certainty the way it's going to play out, because it's still a long time till the next general election. That's a lifetime in politics. But how important is it when you think about it in terms of replacing the governor, lieutenant governor, the secretary of state, attorney general? About 70% of your colleagues are leaving in the Senate, about a third of them over in the House. I mean, this is a big sea change in this election.
It will be a huge seat change, and so the dynamics will be very important. I think the Republicans have had a great message to run on. If you recall, when I ran for the state Senate, Michigan had one of the highest unemployment rates, and now we're at the top in terms of having the lowest unemployment rates. We've made Michigan competitive with the other states, and we've made Michigan a great place to live, and I want to continue on with that record, serving in a different role as Attorney General.
When you gear up for this kind of a race, I'm always interested because I referred to it in an earlier interview as kind of inside politics, because until that selection process is made, you're not necessarily going out and doing retail politics. I mean, you do that, but this is really about going to 83 counties, I assume, and talking to all the county chairmen. So it's a little different than you've done in the past.
Yeah, it's a much smaller audience in terms of asking for people's support in terms of voting. Roughly about 2,400 delegates go to the state convention, so you need a little bit less than half of those, plus one to vote for you. And so I intend to bring my message. I'm seeing great parts of the state on my weekends and my nights where I'm not currently doing my current job as a state senator. So it's a beautiful state to live in. This is where I grew up and where I'm raising my family too with my husband.
When you talk about the Senate, we were also talking about that, it's always a little hard for me to judge what's going to be the focus for you and your colleagues for the next 45 days, however many days you have left in session this year. And then next year, because it is an election year, it seems like the big things in an election years don't get a lot of traction. So if you really want to do something big, it seems like it's got to be this fall. Is there any sense what the agenda looks like or feels like?
Well, certainly auto insurance reform is really kind of the top notch issue right there. Certainly we have one of the highest auto insurance rates, and a couple of reasons why that. I support the Senate package that we passed out about 2 years ago, which really, cut down on the fraud and the abuse in the system, and would have provided ratepayers. There's a current House version which I think has a lot of flaws into it. We'll see what the House does with that, but hopefully there's a reasonable compromise between the House, the Senate, and the governor to give people relief for their auto insurance rates out there.
I know there's also an attempt to do away with the driver responsibility fees. I think that is an issue that originated over in the House. Is that something that you have taken a look at?
We have bills. Senator Hildebrandt from right here in Grand Rapids has those bills, as well as a competing House package as well, and that's something that the Senate will be taking a look at. We certainly want to make sure that people get driver's license, and it certainly was probably a tax on the least that could afford it. But at the same rate, you also want to make sure it's fair. Those people that are on payment plans that are currently in, are they going to be treated the same fairness, or those people that actually did pay their driver's responsibility, is that fair if other people get it wiped out? So certainly there's a lot of issues surrounding that, and I think there's a reasonable compromise to probably be worked out.
When you get ready to embark on this, I mean, there are two different things. You're obviously running for Attorney General, but this is also your last year in the state Senate. Are there any have-tos or want-tos that you want to get done before you're out of the Senate?
I'm very proud of the record that I've established in the legislature for over the 12 years in terms of tackling the issues that really made Michigan a competitive state. I think the last two pieces of legislation I'd like to get through and onto the governor's desk would be the maps dealing with the opioid abuse problem that we have that really cuts down on the doctor shopping and pill mills, and then also focused on a statewide definition for truancy, which really keeps kids in schools and keeps them off the streets and falling into a life of crime. Certainly we've done a lot to reduce our prison population in the state from an all-time high of around close to 55,000. Now it's around 34,000. But certainly we have a long way to go in terms of making sure that people never fall into that prison pipeline to begin with. And I think one way to do that is to have a statewide definition of truancy and really look at why are kids being truant and attack it before it becomes a serious criminal issue.
Republican Speaker of the House Tom Leonard says he is running for Attorney General too, and again, just like the Democrats, those nominees will be picked at the state convention. We're back with more To the Point. When we talk about 2018 as a big election year in Michigan, it really is. Everything from governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, perhaps as many as 70% of the Senate members and a third over in the House will all be new. And that means there'll be a lot of new faces. We'll introduce them to you every week right here when you join us at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning for To the Point.